Today's daf yomi is Horayos daf ches Horayos 8. We're going to start on the bottom of 7b at the first wide line. And today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the chayalim. It's all for the shvuyim and yeshua for Am Yisrael and its Eis Tzara. Gemara tells us that the Bezdin is only liable for idolatry if there would be what's called a mistaken ruling, a helam davar, and a mistaken action. And how do we know this is the case? How do we know that in order for Bezdin to be liable for idolatry, for bad ruling by idolatry, to bring the power and the sire for idolatry, has been a mistaken ruling and a mistaken action? The Tanarabano Fisha Yatzas, because idolatry has its own unique law. I might think that the Bezdin is liable if the people just act improperly. They have to bring this carbon, the power and the sarah for idolatry. So we compare the word in name. So we compare the power to the mistake that happens by idolatry. So the Gemara then asks the question, well, what about the Kohen HaMashiach? The Kohen HaMashiach, Bavodas Kochalim Ol Kotani. So our Mishnah doesn't mention what the law of the Kohen HaMashiach is by a mistaken idolatrous action. We don't know if he has a unique carbon or if it's like the regular people. So Masnis and money, maybe we should say that our Mishnah is whom it's like Rabbi the Tanya who says Mashiach Bavodas Kochavim. What does the Brisa say? Rabbi Omer B'Shigas Ma'aser. Rabbi says that the anointed Kohen, when it comes to idolatry, he's chayav even if there's just a mistaken action, even without a mistaken ruling. Whereas the Chachamim Omrim Behelam Davar, Chachamim say no, that the Kohen HaMashiach also requires a mistaken ruling by idolatry. V'shavin, and they both agree. Shebesi'ira. Everybody agrees that the Kohen HaMashiach brings the same carbon as an individual, which is a female goat or a female sheep. V'shavin she'emevi Ashem Tawai. And they both agree that the Kohen HaMashiach does not bring an Ashem Tawai, like the Bezdin doesn't bring an Ashem Tawai, which is a carbon if you're not sure if you did the sin. So maybe from the fact that the Mishnah doesn't mention anything about the Kohen HaMashiach by idolatry, maybe we say it's the same law as the regular individuals. Gemara says, but Tizbara, do you think this is logical to say that? Because it also doesn't mention what's going to be mentioned in the next Mishnah, that the Kohen HaMashiach only applies to someone to a sin where he does, if it would have been intentional, because accidental as a chatas. It doesn't mention that either. Elatani ha and huadin laha. So it doesn't mention anything. It mentions one, but it's the same thing for all of them. Meaning to say, even though it doesn't mention it, it's the same law, that he has a unique law by the Avodah Zarah, and he's not like a regular individual. My time with the Rebbe, but what's the reason why Rebbe is of the position that idolatry is liable even without a helam davar, even without a mistaken one? Because because it says the Kohen will achieve atonement. So it means a nefesh. When it says a nefesh, that refers to the Mashiach. Hashogeges, that zenosi, bechata bishkaga, means he is liable even without a mistaken ruling, just for an action. Rabbi Savar chadzeh bishkaga yehe. That Rabbi is of the position that this sin is bishkaga yehe, means he is liable even without the helam davar, without the ruling. B'Rabbanan tzari misha chataso bishkaga, one whose sin is accidental. Yatz Mashiach she'en chataso bishkaga ela behelam davar. So he says, no, Chacham say it applies to the Mashiach whose sin is not b'shkaga but behelam davar. V'shavin, and they both agree that the Kohen HaMashiach brings the same carbon as an individual. Minon, what's the basis for that? Amar Kravim nefesh achas echad yachad v'echad nasi v'echad Mashiach kulam b'kol nefesh achasim. meaning it says one soul, and so that both the Nasi, the Mashiach, and the individuals all bring the same carbon for chatas, which is a female goat or female sheep. So now we're on the top of Chesam Aleph. The Shavin She'im Mevi Ashem Tooi, and both the Kohen Mashiach, and the both Rebbe and the Chachamim agree that he does not bring an Ashem Tooi. What's the source for that? They'll say v'chiper of a Kohen al shigaso asher shagav. Kohen shall bring an atonement for the mistake that he made. Rebbe Savar misha kol chato bishkaga. He knows for sure this entire sin was accidental. Yatzazeh she'ein kol chato bishkaga al b'halam davar. So it's excluding, since the pasuk says v'chiper alav hakohen al shigaso asher shagag. It means it only applies to somebody who's going to bring a carbon in general if his whole sin was done b'shogeg. It excludes a Kohen who requires helam davar beforehand by idolatry. So the Gemara says, "Midei kol ktiv," doesn't say all. In, yes, it does. Dimkein nichtov al shigaso lamalei asher shagag hakamash mon da'adika kol chato b'shgaga. That's how Rabbi understands it. The entire sin b'dam b'shgaga excludes the Kohen. Portion of a sin is done by mistaken ruling. Rabbanan, Misha Chato Bishkaga, Rabbanan say someone whose sin is done accidentally, Yatsa Mashiach She'en Chato Bishkaga, comes to exclude the case of the Mashiach whose sin is not done accidentally. So means it's not just a shogeg, but it's also a mistaken ruling. Okay, so now we're up to the next Mishnah. The next Mishnah says, Ein bezin chayavin, court is not liable, ad sheyoru bedavar shezdono kares v'shilas ochatas. The basic rule, the court is only liable if they give a ruling where something which, if was done intentionally, gets kares, and accidentally is a sin offering. The Kohen Mashiach, and also the Kohen Mashiach is only liable if they did it if it's something where shezdono kares v'shilas ochatas. Also not liable for idolatry. So intentionally kares, accidentally chatas. Gemara says, what's the source for this idea that the court is only liable if it will be intentionally they get kares and accidentally they get shogeg, that chatas? That's where the court would bring this paralam davar shel tzibur. What's the source? Titania Rabbi Omer Nemer Kan Oeha says in the pasuk that they know about the sin, and and it says by achos ish, it says by achos ishto, it says by the prohibition of achos isha, the sister of his wife, which is a kares penalty. It says there also the word aleha. Malo and davar shezdono kares v'shilas ochatas. Avkan davar shezdono kares v'shilas ochatas. We say that has to be the same law of intentional kares with an accidental sin offering. So Gemara says ashkachon tzibor. So we find this halacha by the tzibor that they're liable for paralam davar shel tzibor if it's something shezdono kares v'shilas ochatas. But Mashiach, and how do we know that this applies by the Kohen Mashiach as well? So we compare the tzibor to the Kohen Mashiach because it says Lashma Sa'am. It says by the guilt of the people. So therefore, Hari Mashiach Tzibor. And so therefore we know that the Kohen Mashiach is like the tzibor. Nasi. How do we know that the law of the Nasi is, or the Melech is like the Kohen Mashiach? Yoev mitzvos. It says, we make zero shot for the word mitzvos. Kstiv gabi nasi, it says by the nasi, v'asa achas mitzvos mitzvos Hashem. That's one of the mitzvos of Hashem. Kstiv the tzibur, v'su achas mikol mitzvos. Ma tzibur davar shezdono kares v'shigas ochates. Just like the tzibur, something intentionally is kares and accidentally is a sin offering. Am nasi davar shezdono kares v'shigas ochatas. Yachid, how do we know that the individual also is going to be liable for a chatas only about something where if it was shezdono kares v'shigas ochatas? How do we know that he only brings basically the chatas offering, if it would be intentionally, would beget kares. How do we know that by the individual? Amakravim nefesh. Yomo tachto million. We compare, it says the word nefesh, we compare it to the passage right above it. We compare it to the passage right above it, which is the passage of the Nasi. Okay, so now we go to the next piece. It says, also by idolatry, it has to be something which is intentionally kares, accidentally is achatas. Bavodas kochavim, you know, what's the source? Tanarabanan, ufishiyatza avodas kochavim lidon ba'atzma. Idolatry is its own separate law. Yachol chayavin afil adavar she'en tidon kares v'shigos achatas. I may think you're liable even on something where that if it's intentional, you don't get kares, and if it's accidental, you don't get chatas. Never come einay, never einay. Ma'alan davar shel dono kares v'shigos achatas. So compared to the paralam davar shel tzibur, we learn the same law. So too here also afkan davar shel dono kares v'shigos achatas. Where it says Ashkan Tzibor. Okay, we learn this law with respect to an offering when a mistaken ruling by idolatry and a mistaken action by the community that they bring this power and this sire. But Nasi Mashiach, you know, and how do we know the same law by the Nasi and the Kohen of Mashiach? Amarkrav Nefesh Achas, because it says in the pasuk Nefesh Achas Techatab B'Shkaga. And we learn out that applies to to the Nasi, the Yachid, the individual, and the Mashiach. Kulam b'kol nefesh achasein. They're all included in nefesh achas. And we compare it to the community one, which is right above it. So the Gemara says, but this only works on it only works if we say that we take the pasuk, the word that says allow by a communal sin offering, the param davar shel tzibor, and we compare it to the word allow that appears by one's wife's sister, achos ishto. But el rabbanan demafki Horayos the saros. But according to Rabbanon, who say that the word allow is coming to teach us that you don't do yibum on an erva, and also on the co-wife of an erva. Davar says don't occur for shilas ochata. So no, how do the rabbis know this idea that it has to be something which is intentionally kares and accidentally chatas in order to bring the paralam davar shel tzibor? So the Gemara says nafku, who they learn out from midanasni Rabbi Shmuel Levi would break. From what Rabbi Shmuel Levi taught to his son, what did he say? Torah achas yelachem. So spishkaga. Nefesh asher taseh biyad rama. It says in the pasuk, it says should have one law to one who does it accidentally. Nefesh asher taseh biyad rama. So that's what the pasuk says, which means huksha kol Torah kula avodas kochavim. The whole Torah is compared to idolatry. Ma'avodas kochavim shechayav al zdar kares. Just like by idolatry, you're liable for intentionally kares accidentally for a sin offering. Avkan also here by param davar and tzibur shechayav al zdona kares hashiglas chatas. The Gemara says, "Well, Ashkan yachid nasi mashiach beim avodas kom beim mishar mitzvos." Fine, so we know that this applies to an individual, to a nasi mashiach, both by idolatry and by other mitzvos. But tzibur minah, and how do we know to compare it back to the community? We learn out the Elyon case from the Tachton case. We learn out the upper case from the lower case. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Okay, so fine. So now the Gemara says, the Rebbe Okay, so basically we learn out the law of the communal idolatry because it's next to the passage of the individual idolatry. Gemara says, "Rabbi Had Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi my Avalei." Rabbi who makes the Gzer Sheva of Haleah from between Palam Devar Shel Tzibor and Achos Ishto. So what does he do with the teaching of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? So Gemara says, "My Avalei Mapik Leil Tanya." He needs it according to, like we said, according to the following brayso. Lishematzinu Shechilak Hakosov Pein Rabim Leyachidim. You know, the Torah draws a distinction between the many and the individuals. Rabban b'sayif, umimonon, that when the idolaters sin, they get killed by the sword, and they lose their money by irani dachas. Yachidim b'skila umimonon palad, and the individuals get stoning and their money is saved. Yochol nachluk b'korban. I might think they have a different korban as well. Talmud Omer Torah chasiyah. That should be the same law. So I'm asking for Rav Chilka Me'agronia, time adul chiluk hakosef. So if it weren't for the fact that in Torah drew a distinction between the individuals and the many, we would have thought that they all bring the same korban. If we're not for the fact that Torah drew this distinction, we would have said, if the Torah didn't say that, I would have thought, nachok, that if we're not for the fact that the Torah said, Torah Chatzi Elachem, I would have thought that they have to have a separate korban. But if that's the case, Havamina Nachok, that my Naisi, what would be the separate korban that they bring? Naisi power, if we want to say that the new people, the masses, the Yirani Dachas have to bring a separate korban, what would they bring? Naisi power, Tzibor B'Sharma. You can't bring a bowl because that's what the regular communal mistake offering is. Naisi parwa of a sarochat. So if they bring a bull and a goat, that's also tzibur v'avodas kachamudamaisi. That's also what they bring by a regular communal offering. By idolatry. Naisi sire. If we were to say they're just going to bring a male goat, Nasi Basar Mitzvah Sudamaisi. That's what the Bashar Mitzvah Sudamaisi. That's what the Nasi brings by all other mitzvahs. Naisi Sira, bring a female goat. Yachanami Ainokamar. That's the individual offering. So the Gemara says, okay, what are we going to say? No, it's Sakadai Dechamina Tzibor. That when the community worships idolatry accidentally, I might have thought that they say Maisi Parwa Olav Asaro Chatas. I might have thought that they reversed it. That generally speaking, the community brings a bull for an oil and a goat for Chatas. But this Irani Dachat, I might have thought Naisi Ifcha, that they bring the opposite, a Parwa Chatas for sorrow, or a bull for a sin offering, and a goat as an oil. Or Inami. I might have thought they need to, but they can't because they have nothing to bring. So therefore, Kamashma, we don't say that. Because the Pasuk has to draw this distinction. The Koyam but everybody's other position, Kiksive cry, when these psukim in Bamidbar are written, that they're written by idolatry. My mashma, how do we know that these psukim are written by idolatry? These psukim which we actually read, which we just read, we have the position that they're talking about idolatry. How do we know that? My mashma, Amar Rav Vitim Rav Shimolezi, Amar Lakadi, Amar Krav, Chitishkavu Tasu. It's called mitzvah sa'elu. If you make a mistake, you don't do any of these commandments. Ezui mitzvah sheishkula kol mitzvahs, which is the mitzvah which is equivalent to all the mitzvahs of Torah. That is idolatry. The debate. Rabbi Tana Amakra Asher Dibra Hashem al Moshe Uksiv Asher Tziva Hashem Alechem Alechem B'Yam Moshe Edu Mitzvah She B'Dibur Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu V'Tziva Yidei Moshe, which is the mitzvah that God spoke and was commanded by Moshe. Havemer Zu Avodas Kochavim. This idolatry. The Tana Deber Shmuel Anochi V'Yelcha. We heard Anochi and V'Yelcha from God, and then Moshe came along and commanded. Mishmuel Tana, he learns it out from here. Which is the first mitzvah of the Ten Commandments. This is idolatry. Amar Mara, as our mitzvahs in Yisrael b'Mara, but weren't they already commanded this before the Ten Commandments by Mara? Where there are the 7 Noahide laws and then these 3 extra commandments. So, it goes back to the first answer. So, meaning to say either Kedira, B'Shua Malevi, or not from the Pasuk of Eskol Mitzvah Sa'ila. Now up to the next Mishnah. Ein Chayavin al Aseh v'al Aseh b'Mikdash. Now, they're not liable to bring a power on the Rishon Tzibur if it was a Aseh was Aseh b'Mikdash, which is a carbon O of the Yored. It's not something that's a dono kari to shigas or chatas. Means if you say mistaken ruling about entering the temple, tumas mikdash v'kadasha. The aim of being asham toa al aseh v'losei sheba mikdash. You also don't bring an asham toa on that. But you do bring a carbon element of shal tzibor and a positive commandment or a negative commandment of a nida. You also bring an asham toa on that. What's a positive commandment of the nida? If the court made a mistake of ruling that people they would have to bring a carbon approachment on nida. If they don't say to separate from the nida in advance of her nida period. A mitzvah slow say al tavo on nida, which is don't come close to nida. If they say you can come close, this is something that bring a carbon. What's the source for this idea? The community doesn't bring a carbon. If it's a mistaken ruling that you don't bring a shigas or chatas kavua, and also that they don't bring an asham toa in this. But it's based upon Xer Shava. It says in the Torah, Hashem bechatas, it says the word Hashem by an individual offering. Asham Tawai, and also says it by an Asham Tawai, V'nemar v'ashmu b'tzibor. And by a communal offering, it says the word v'ashmu. Ma'ava Hashem b'yachid, b'chatas kavua. Ava Hashmu b'tzibor b'chatas kavua. It's only by a fixed offering, and not an Asham Tawai. Ma tzibor chatas kavua, afasham toa nami ein ba el al safek chatas kavua. So the asham toa is only brought on something that if it will be a doubt about something that's a chatas kavua. Amri ihachi carbon all of the urine nami. If that's the case, why do you learn the law asham toa from that? We should also learn Asham Toa from a carbon all the Yori, because Aksiv Ayaki Hashem Lachas Mi'ela. So we should learn out from carbon that it's carbon all the Yori. The Gemara says done in Hashem and Ashmo, they ain't done in Hashem from Yasham. My Nafkamino, what's the difference? About time very small, Shavakoin and Volikoin, Zui Shiva, Zui Bia, aren't they the same? The ode Min Va'ashem, Nelev Min Va'ashem Mitumas Mikdash V'Kadash, Hu Tamei Va'ashem. Why don't we compare it to that? So Amar Papa, done in Va'ashem. Mitzvah Hashem, min Hashem, and Mitzvah Hashem. So there's 2 words, Hashem and Mitzvah Hashem. I'm going to have seen by Asher or Papa, V'nelef Hashem, V'nesias Avon, min Hashem, V'nesias Avon. Why don't we learn out from Hashem and Nesias Avon? Elam Rav Nachbar Yitzchak, done in Hashem, V'mitzvah Hashem, Asher Otasena, and Hashem Mitzvah Hashem Otasena, V'al Yochiach, Shmias Kol, Bitu Etzvasayim, Tuas Mikdash B'Kedashev. You don't learn that. Okay, we just do the next Mishnah. Ein chayavin al shmias kol. The bezin does not bring a carbon al shmias kol. Means say that they try to get somebody to they say you don't have to bring it to you don't have to swear testimony. I'll be mistaken ruling about an oath. Tumas mikdash v'kadasha. Because in all these cases, he brings a carbon all of the Yorid, and the Bezin only brings a power on Devar Tzibor and something that is the Chad of Chatas. By Nazi, and this refers to the king, Kayotze Bam, he's like the court. He only brings his offering on something that will be a Chatas, but not on carbon all of the Yorid. Rabbi Kiva says, the king does bring a carbon all of the Yorid. In these cases, chutz mishmias kol, with the exception of if he testifies, shamel chodan v'odan, until the king does not is not a judge, v'omeid, so he's also not a witness. Okay, we'll stop here. These davim are very, like your head spins because there's a lot of laws, very dense, but we do the best we can. Yashar koach.